On the morning of September 14, 1851, the overseer was discovered by workers arriving at the Hateville cotton processing facility in southern Georgia, his skull crushed beyond recognition beneath the massive iron press. The machines will have been turned 17 times, a force sufficient to compress 200 pounds of raw cotton into a single bale, or to reduce a human head to less than 3 inches thick. The brutality of the death was disturbing, but what the county sheriff found 3 days later made it far worse: a small wooden step stool, positioned perfectly beside the press, built for someone no taller than 4 feet. A child had operated the murder weapon. But this was not just any child. According to plantation records discovered in 1923 and immediately sealed by the Georgia Historical Society, the responsible boy had been purchased 8 months earlier for the price of a damaged tool, 8 cents. His name appears in a single document. His crime is absent from all official records, and his fate stands as one of the most deliberately obscured cases in antebellum Georgia history. What transpired in that cotton press facility reveals something far more terrible than murder. Before we continue with the story of Hateville's forgotten atrocity, I must ask you something. This story contains truths that were buried for over a century. Facts that powerful families spent generations trying to erase. If you're ready to hear what really happened in the shadows of Georgia's cotton empire, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I'm also curious. Comment below and tell me what state or city you're listening from. Are you in the South? Do you live near where these events unfolded? Let's discover together what the history books refuse to tell us. The story truly begins not with violence, but with commerce, the kind of cold, calculated business that measured human worth in fractions of a dollar and treated people as livestock. In 1851, Hateville was little more than a crossroads, a collection of structures serving the cotton economy that dominated Georgia like a white-flowered plague. The town itself consisted of 23 buildings, 2 churches, 1 general store, a blacksmith shop, and the rest were homes of plantation owners who primarily lived on their rural properties, coming to Hateville only for business or Sunday worship. Yet the true heart of Hateville was the cotton facility, a sprawling complex of warehouses and processing equipment where raw cotton from surrounding plantations was weighed, compressed, and prepared for shipment to the textile mills of New England and England. The facility belonged to Cyrus Gantry, a man whose wealth came not from growing cotton, but from handling it, charging plantation owners for processing and storage and taking his percentage from every bale that passed through his machines. Gantry had inherited the business from his father in 1847 and had expanded it considerably, installing new presses from Philadelphia and hiring additional workers. He was 34 years old in 1851, married with 3 daughters, and considered himself a reasonable man who ran his operation with efficiency and profit. The processing facility operated year-round, but the true frenzy arrived during harvest season, from August through October, when wagon after wagon arrived loaded with raw cotton and the presses ran from dawn until well past midnight. The work was brutal: lifting, sorting, feeding the massive mechanical presses, operating the baling equipment, loading finished bales onto railway cars. Most of this labor was performed by 37 enslaved men and women owned by Gantry specifically for the facility's operation. One of Gantry's overseers was Tobias Strad, a man of 41 years who had worked at the facility for nearly a decade. Strad was known in equal measure for his efficiency and his cruelty. The enslaved workers feared him more than Gantry himself, and with good reason. Strad believed in correction through pain, a philosophy he applied liberally with a leather strap kept coiled at his belt. He lived in a small house adjacent to the facility, close enough to hear if work slowed during the night shifts, close enough to respond immediately to any disruption in productivity. Strad had never married. His life was the facility, the machines, the constant rhythm of cotton being transformed from raw bolls into compressed bales worth their weight in gold. He took pride in the numbers, in his operations efficiency, in his ability to extract maximum productivity from the workers under his control. He kept meticulous records of every bale processed, every hour worked, every instance of what he called defiance that required correction. But Tobias Strad had a peculiarity that others noticed but rarely mentioned. He collected not valuable things, not coins or jewelry or art, but the broken and damaged, the objects others discarded. His small house was filled with cracked pottery he'd mended, clocks that no longer kept proper time but still ticked, furniture with missing legs propped up with wooden blocks. He found value, he told the few who asked, in things others considered worthless. This philosophy extended beyond objects. In February of 1851, a slave auction was held in Ville, not a large affair, just the liquidation of an estate after its owner, Nathaniel Vickers, died suddenly of apoplexy. His widow was returning to her family in South Carolina and wished to settle all accounts before departing Georgia. The auction was held on a cold Saturday morning in front of the general store, with perhaps 40 men gathered to examine the merchandise and place their bids. Most of the enslaved people sold that day fetched expected prices. Young men in their prime went for $1,200 to $1,500, women of childbearing age for slightly less, children for $500 to $700 depending on their age and health. But one lot drew uncomfortable laughter and dismissive comments from the assembled buyers. Lot number 17 was a boy listed in the auction document as approximately 11 years old, his name recorded only as Small Thomas. The auctioneer's description was brutally clinical: dwarf Negro boy. Approximate height 3 feet 9 inches. Proportions irregular, left arm shorter than right, spine curved, feet turned inward, has been employed in light household tasks, understands English, generally obedient. The boy stood on the auction block wearing clothes several sizes too large, his head barely reaching the auctioneer's waist. His condition was immediately apparent to everyone present, what we would now recognize as a form of dwarfism, likely achondroplasia, combined with complications affecting his limbs and spine. In 1851, such conditions were little understood, often attributed to maternal sin or divine punishment. The enslaved community often protected such individuals, finding them suited work, but to slave owners, they represented a calculation, the cost of feeding and housing someone against their potential productivity. The bidding for Small Thomas opened at $50. There were no takers. The auctioneer dropped to $30. Still nothing. At $10, a few men chuckled. At $5, someone suggested the boy might be useful for scaring crows from a field. At $1, the auctioneer's voice carried frustration, a desire to simply complete the sale. 8 cents. Tobias Straude called out from the back of the crowd. The laughter stopped. Men turned to stare at Straude, trying to understand if he was mocking the process or making a legitimate offer. 8 cents was the price for a pound of nails or a small bag of seed. It was not a price for a human being, even one considered damaged. 8 cents, Straude repeated, walking forward through the crowd. That's my bid. The auctioneer looked to the estate executor, who simply shrugged. The widow wanted everything sold. Sold, the auctioneer declared, his voice flat with distaste, to Tobias Straude for 8 cents. Straude paid the money immediately, pulling 8 copper pennies from his coat pocket and placing them in the auctioneer's hand one at a time, letting each coin clink against the others. Then he walked to the auction block, looked down at Small Thomas, and spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear. You're mine now. You'll work at the cotton facility. You'll do what I tell you when I tell you, and you'll do it well. Do you understand? The boy nodded once, his dark eyes meeting Straude's for just a moment before dropping to the ground. Those who witnessed the exchange would later remember that moment, would remember the boy's expression as unreadable, not fearful, not defiant, simply blank, as if something behind his eyes had gone dark. Straude led his new acquisition through the streets of Hapville, the boy struggling to keep pace with his uneven gait, his twisted feet making each step a visible effort. They arrived at the cotton facility just as the afternoon shift was beginning, the sound of machinery filling the air with its rhythmic thunder. This here is what I paid 8 cents for, Straude announced to the workers in the main processing area, his hand gripping the boy's shoulder. But even things bought cheap have use. He's small enough to crawl into spaces you can't reach, to clean under the machines, to fetch tools from tight spots. His fingers work fine. I seen that much. So he'll earn his keep, same as all of you. What Straude didn't announce, what he kept to himself in those first weeks, was his real motivation for the purchase. Yes, the boy could fit into small spaces. Yes, there was practical value. But there was something else, something that satisfied a need Strahd himself probably didn't fully understand, the ownership of something broken, something he could shape and control, something that proved his belief that even the most damaged thing had value, if only you knew how to extract it. Small Thomas was given a corner in the facility's storage barn where other workers slept, provided with a thin blanket and a wooden crate for his few possessions. He was fed the same rations as the others, cornmeal, occasionally salt pork, sometimes molasses. The work began immediately, crawling beneath the massive presses to retrieve dropped tools or cotton fragments, cleaning thick grease from gears regular-sized workers couldn't reach, fetching water in buckets he had to grip with both hands. The other enslaved workers showed him kindness when Strahd wasn't watching. A woman named Bess, who cooked for the facility workers, would save him extra portions of food. An elderly man called Prophet, who maintained the equipment, showed him which machines were most dangerous, which spaces to avoid. They tried to shelter him, these people who had their own burdens, their own daily struggles for survival. But Tobias Strahd watched everything. In the months that followed, Strahd developed what he called a training program for the boy. It began with simple tasks performed under observation, Strahd timing each one with a pocket watch and recording the results in a small leather notebook. If the boy completed a task in the expected time, he received his full ration. If he failed, the ration was reduced. This was the first level of control, hunger as motivation. The second level came in April, 2 months after the purchase. Strahd had a wooden sign made, crude letters burned into a pine board, 8-cent boy. He hung this sign around Thomas's neck with a leather cord, forcing him to wear it during all working hours. When others objected, suggesting it was needlessly cruel, Strahd's response was chilling in its logic. He needs to know his value, he said, so he can appreciate that I'm giving him the chance to prove he's worth more. When he's earned back his purchase price in productivity, I'll take the sign off. Not before. By Strahd's calculations, at 8 cents, with the boy's limited capabilities, the sign would remain around his neck for approximately 7 years. This assumed, of course, that the boy survived that long. Many didn't think he would. But small Thomas survived. More than that, he adapted. He learned to move through the facility with surprising speed despite his disability, his uneven gait becoming almost rhythmic. He learned which tasks he could perform quickly, how to anticipate Strahd's demands before they were voiced. He learned to make himself useful in ways that went beyond Strahd's original intentions. And this, perhaps, was his first mistake, because Tobias Strahd noticed everything. And what he noticed by the summer of 1851 was that the boy he'd purchased for 8 cents was proving more valuable than anticipated. Small Thomas could indeed fit into spaces no one else could reach, but he'd also developed an understanding of the machinery itself, how the presses worked, how the gears meshed, which bolts needed tightening. Prophet had taught him well, perhaps too well. In late July, during the early harvest season, a mechanical problem threatened to shut down the main cotton press for days. A drive chain had broken and fallen into the gear mechanism deep inside the press housing, a space too small for any adult to access, too dangerous to disassemble with cotton arriving by the wagon load. Strahd looked at the problem, looked at small Thomas, and saw his solution. "Boy," he said, his voice carrying the tone that meant absolute obedience, "you're going in there to get that chain. I'll walk you through what you need to do." Prophet stepped forward, his old face creased with concern. "Mr. Strahd, sir, that space ain't safe. If someone was to engage the mechanism while he's inside." "No one's going to engage nothing," Strahd snapped. "I'll be right here watching." Boy goes in, retrieves the chain, comes back out. Simple. It wasn't simple. The space inside the press housing was barely large enough for the boy's body, requiring him to crawl on his stomach through gaps between iron plates and wooden frames, all coated in thick grease and cotton lint. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with oil fumes. And everywhere, just inches from his body, were the massive gears and plates that would crush him instantly if activated. But small Thomas crawled inside. Following Strahd's shouted instructions, he worked for nearly an hour in that mechanical darkness, his twisted hands fumbling with the heavy chain. The other workers stood in absolute silence, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of metal scraping metal, the boy's labored breathing, Strahd's voice directing every movement. When small Thomas finally emerged, covered in black grease, the chain clutched in his hands, something had changed in his expression. The blankness was still there, but underneath it, those who looked closely might have seen something else, a calculation, an awareness, a kind of knowledge that came from spending an hour inches away from the machinery that could end his life with a single lever pull. Strahd took the chain, examined it, then looked down at the boy. "See? You're worth more than 8 cents after all. Keep proving it, and maybe that sign comes off sooner than I thought." But he didn't remove the sign. Not then. Not in the weeks that followed. Even as the boy continued to prove useful, the sign remained. 8 cents. That's what you are. That's all you'll ever be, unless I decide otherwise. By early September, the harvest season was at its peak. The facility operated around the clock, workers sleeping in shifts, the machines never stopping. Strahd himself barely slept, moving through the facility at all hours, checking productivity, demanding faster work, using his leather strap when he felt workers were slowing down. Small Thomas had been assigned to the night shift, working from sunset until dawn, primarily maintaining the area around the main press where Strahd himself usually stationed during the busiest hours. The boy would fetch water, clean the work area, remove cotton debris, and increasingly be called upon to make minor adjustments to the machinery. It was during these night shifts, when the facility was lit only by oil lanterns and the work took on a hypnotic, exhausting rhythm, that the other workers noticed small Thomas watching the press, not just glancing at it, but studying it with an unusual intensity. He would stand in the shadows, his small form barely visible, his eyes tracking the movement of the great iron plates, the turning of the screw mechanism, the way the pressure built slowly and then released. Prophet noticed. On a break one night in early September, he'd pulled the boy aside, speaking quietly in the careful dialect of the enslaved. "Child, you got to be careful what you think about. Some thoughts, they grow like poison oak. Start small, but they spread. Cover everything. Choke out what's good." Small Thomas had looked up at him, and for just a moment the blankness had cracked. "How much pressure it take?" the boy had asked, his voice soft. "To crush cotton down to a bale." Prophet's blood had gone cold. "More than you want to know about. More than you should be thinking about." "Just wondering," the boy had said, and the blankness had returned, smooth as water over stones. 3 days later, on the morning of September 14, 1851, Tobias Strahd was found dead beneath the main cotton press. The discovery came at dawn when the morning shift workers arrived. The facility should have been full of activity, but instead they found an unusual silence. The main press had been shut down, its massive mechanism frozen mid-cycle. Oil lamps still burned, casting flickering shadows. And there, beneath the press itself, was Tobias Strahd, or what remained of him. His body was positioned on the press bed, the massive iron plate suspended approximately 3 inches above where his head should have been. The word "should" is crucial, because Tobias Strahd no longer had a head in any recognizable sense. The press plate had come down with such force that what lay beneath was little more than a dark stain. The body below the neck appeared untouched, clothes intact, arms at his sides, but above the shoulders was simply absence. What made the scene even more disturbing was its precision. This was not a clumsy accident. The press had been operated with care, with knowledge. Someone had positioned Strahd on the press bed and then worked the mechanism with deliberate intent. The wheel had been turned 17 times, they would later determine. Each complete rotation added thousands of pounds of pressure. After 17 rotations, the pressure was sufficient to drive every ounce of air, every drop of moisture, every hint of softness from whatever was caught beneath that iron plate. But here was the detail that would obsess the investigation. The wheel was positioned nearly 8 feet off the ground, its handles designed for men of average height. How had someone short enough to require a step stool managed to apply the force necessary to turn it 17 times? The answer was found 3 feet from the press, a wooden step stool, carefully constructed from scrap lumber, its surface showing scuff marks. But this stool was built low, barely 15 inches high. Whoever had used it stood no taller than 4 feet. Sheriff Edmund Howell arrived within an hour. A veteran of frontier law enforcement, he found the scene, according to his report, most disturbing to contemplate. His initial questions were obvious: who had been working the night shift? Where were they now? The answers brought more questions. The night shift had consisted of 12 enslaved workers supervised by Straude himself. According to the workers, Straude had been alive until approximately 3 a.m. After that, accounts grew hazier. The work was hypnotic, exhausting. What the workers could confirm was that Small Thomas had been assigned to the main press area that night. "Where is this boy now?" Sheriff Howell had asked. No one knew. His sleeping corner was empty, his blanket folded neatly. The 8-cent boy sign lay on top of the crate that held his few possessions. The search began immediately. 20 men spread through Hapville and the surrounding countryside. But Small Thomas had vanished. While the search continued, Sheriff Howell examined the crime scene. The more he studied it, the less it made sense. The positioning suggested Straude had either been unconscious or convinced to lie there voluntarily. But why would Straude, a man known for suspicion, allow that? The mechanism showed careful operation. This wasn't frantic work. Someone had taken their time. Dr. Marcus Fenneman, the town physician, noted in his report, death would have occurred within seconds of the cranium's collapse. However, given the evidence of progressive compression, the deceased may have experienced significant terror and pain in the moments before mortality. The precision suggests deliberate intent. On the second day, Prophet was brought in for questioning. Sheriff Howell sat across a rough wooden table from the elderly man. "Tell me about the boy," Howell said. "What was he like?" "The child was quiet, sir," Prophet said carefully. "Kept to himself mostly. Did his work without complaining." "Did the boy ever threaten Straude? Ever show defiance?" "No, sir. Child just did what he was told. Wore that sign every day without a word." "But you taught him about the machines," Howell pressed. "You showed him how they worked." "Yes, sir," Prophet said, feeling the trap. "So he'd know how to stay safe. So he wouldn't get hurt. So he understood them well enough to operate them." "Sir, that press requires 2 strong men to turn that wheel. The boy couldn't hardly reach it, even with that stool. His arms aren't the same length. His back is twisted. He couldn't generate the force needed." This was the central contradiction. How could a small boy with physical disabilities manage what typically required 2 adult men? Sheriff Howell stood and walked to the jail's window. "Unless," he said slowly, "he wasn't working alone. Unless someone helped him." The implication was clear. This was conspiracy. And in 1851 Georgia, that was far more dangerous than a single crime. Over the next week, every enslaved person who'd worked the night shift was questioned. But the accounts were frustratingly consistent. Everyone had been at their stations. No one had seen anything unusual. And critically, no one admitted to seeing Small Thomas during those crucial hours. The sign became a focal point. It had been found in the boy's sleeping area, removed at some point during that last night. What did that signify? Bess, the cook, was questioned about the boy's state of mind. She described him as unchanged, quiet. But when pressed, she said something that chilled Howell: "That child never showed anger, sir. Never saw him cry, neither. He was like a bucket with all the water drained out, just empty. But he watched things. Watched the machines mostly. Studied them like some men study scripture. Like he was looking for answers in all those gears and wheels. Answers to what? Howell had asked. How things work, I suppose. How pressure builds. How things break. She paused. How something small can move something big if you understand the right way to apply force. This was as close to an accusation as anyone would come. But where was he? How had a child with distinctive limitations vanished so completely? The search expanded. Notices were posted. Slave catchers were hired. The reward started at $10, more than 100 times his purchase price, and eventually rose to $50. Then, on September 22, 8 days after the murder, a discovery changed everything. A farmer named Josiah Teague, clearing brush near Redemption Creek, found child-sized footprints preserved in dried mud. They were irregular, the left foot turned inward, the right dragging slightly, exactly consistent with small Thomas's disability. The prints led from the creek bank into the water, then disappeared. Following the tracks backward, Teague discovered a small hollow beneath an oak tree. Inside, the torn remnants of a shirt and a single copper penny pressed into the soft earth. Sheriff Howell arrived, bringing Prophet to confirm. The old man examined the footprints. That's the boy's walking pattern, sir. Can't be nobody else. The timeline was chilling. The track suggested small Thomas had covered 8 miles from Hateville, through darkness and unfamiliar terrain, despite his severe mobility limitations. But the tracks led into the creek and vanished. Had he drowned? Yet the creek was shallow, barely 2 or 3 feet deep during the drought. The current was gentle. Drowning seemed unlikely. An alternative theory emerged. Perhaps the boy had used the creek deliberately, waiting to hide his scent. The copper penny troubled Sheriff Howell most. Why leave a coin? When shown to Cyrus Gantry, the facility owner's face went pale. Straude paid 8 pennies for that boy, Gantry said, his hands shaking. 8 cents. He used to mock him about it. Do you think the boy left this as some kind of message? Like he was returning what he was bought for? It was a disturbing thought, suggesting premeditation, symbolic thinking, a level of consciousness about his own commodification that made the crime feel less like panic and more like a statement. The search continued for 3 more weeks, but no trace was found. By mid-October, Sheriff Howell closed his investigation with a report that satisfied no one. The official conclusion: Tobias Straude had been murdered by person or persons unknown, likely including the enslaved boy called Small Thomas, who had subsequently perished in Redemption Creek. But Howell's private notes, discovered years later, told a different story. I do not believe the child drowned. The evidence suggests calculation beyond his years, assistance beyond what any witness will admit, and an escape planned with care. Someone helped him. I cannot prove this, and in truth, I am not certain I wish to. Justice in this case may have been served outside the law. The mystery has never been solved. But before we explore the consequences, I want to hear from you. Do you think Small Thomas acted alone? Could a child really have the strength and knowledge to operate that press? Drop your theories in the comments below. And if this story is keeping you on edge, hit that like button and share it. Now, let's discover what Hateville tried so desperately to bury. The death of Tobias Straude should have sparked outrage, demands for justice, public executions. Instead, what followed was a conspiracy of silence that spread through Hateville like fog. In the weeks after, the story began to change. Initial newspaper reports in the Hateville Gazette were detailed and lurid, but by late October, articles grew shorter, vaguer. By November, the story had disappeared entirely. This wasn't accidental. Cyrus Gantry had quietly approached the newspaper's editor, Horace Kimmel, with a proposal. Continued reporting was damaging to business confidence. The amount of money that changed hands was never recorded, but Kimmel's sudden ability to upgrade his printing press that winter suggested the conversation had been profitable. But Gantry's motivation wasn't just business. Something else bothered him. Going through Strahd's effects, he discovered the overseer's notebook. The final entries disturbed him deeply. In the weeks before his death, Strahd had become obsessed with Small Thomas, his tone shifting from clinical to something darker, more personal. August 29. The 8-cent boy completed retrieval from press housing in 42 minutes, 7 minutes faster than previous attempt. His understanding exceeds expectations. I believe I have found something remarkable. September 3. Observed the boy watching the main press. His focus was absolute. When questioned, he claimed simple curiosity. I do not believe him. There is calculation behind those eyes. September 8. The boy asked me how much force the press generates at full compression. I told him. He said nothing, but I saw him counting on his fingers afterward. What is he calculating? The final entry was dated September 13, the night before the murder. I have made a decision regarding the 8-cent boy. His productivity has exceeded expectations. Tomorrow, I will remove the sign and inform him he has earned back his purchase price. Perhaps I will even teach him to read. A damaged tool, properly maintained, conserved for years. Gantry stared at that entry. Strahd had planned to free the boy from the sign, to reward him. And yet the next night, he was dead. Had Small Thomas known? And if so, why commit murder when his situation was about to improve? Unless the damage went deeper than Strahd understood. Gantry burned the notebook. He told no one. Meanwhile, the enslaved workers developed their own understanding, shared only in whispers. According to this version, passed down, Small Thomas hadn't acted alone in the way Sheriff Howell suspected. The help came in the form of opportunity and silence. The story went that Strahd, in the early hours of September 14, had discovered a mechanical problem with the main press. He'd called for Small Thomas to examine it. What Strahd hadn't known was that the problem had been created deliberately. While Strahd bent over the press bed, explaining what he was looking for, the boy had simply acted. The press will had a release lever, a safety feature to quickly drop the plate several inches. Small Thomas had pulled that lever while Strahd's head was beneath the plate. The initial drop had been enough to stun him, to pin him. After that, turning the wheel hadn't required two men's strength. It had required only time, patience, and the mechanical advantage of the step stool the boy had built from scrap lumber. 17 turns, an hour of work, a quarter rotation at a time. And the other workers? They had heard nothing unusual because the sound was normal. They had seen nothing because they had practiced the essential survival skill of the enslaved, the ability to not see what might get them killed. When questioned, they spoke truth. They had been at their stations, but failed to mention their willful blindness, the circle of silence they created. This version explained the precision, the lack of struggle, the escape. But it raised darker questions. If the others had known, had participated through silence, did that make them accomplices? Or was their inaction simply another form of survival? By the spring of 1852, Hapville had largely moved on. The facility continued under new management. But something had changed in the atmosphere. There was a sense of possibility now, a tiny crack in the absolute power. Strahd's death had proven the system wasn't invulnerable. This didn't manifest in open rebellion, but in small acts, a missing tool, mysterious problems, work that took just a bit longer. A general slowing that cost Gantry perhaps 5% of his productivity. The new overseer, Duncan Talbot, was smart enough to recognize it. He knew Strahd's mistake hadn't been cruelty, that was expected, but its personal nature. So Talbot maintained discipline through routine rather than spite, through rules rather than capricious punishment. He never made anyone wear a sign. And in doing so, he ensured the memory of Tobias Strahd faded further. But one person couldn't let it go, Strahd's widow, Margaret. She hired a private investigator, Chester Wardell, paying him with her last widow's settlement. Wardell spent 6 weeks in Hapville. His final report to Margaret was devastating. I believe your husband was murdered by the boy, likely with the tacit cooperation of other workers. However, in investigating his treatment of his workers, I discovered patterns of behavior that were extraordinarily cruel. The boy was subjected to deliberate humiliation. I cannot condone murder, but I can understand it. Your husband created the circumstances of his own death. The report contained details that made Margaret weep from shame. Wardell concluded that small Thomas had almost certainly died, his body buried by someone who wanted him to rest in peace. I recommend you let this matter rest, he wrote. Further investigation will only bring pain. Margaret took his advice. She burned the report. When she died in 1871, her papers contained no reference to Tobias Straude. But she left one curious item, a small leather pouch containing 7 copper pennies, wrapped in a note that read, "A debt unpaid." The truth about what happened to small Thomas may never be known, but the ripples continued. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share it. Hit that like button and subscribe. Because what we're about to discover next will change everything. Just when the story seemed ended, a discovery in 1889 forced historians to reconsider. In March, workers building a new railroad line found a small, collapsing cabin hidden in a hollow. Inside were human remains, a small skeleton with severe skeletal abnormalities. Next to it, a rusted tin cup, rotted clothing, and a small wooden box with 8 copper pennies arranged in a perfect circle. The discovery made the newspapers. The county physician estimated the skeleton had been there for 30 to 40 years. But the cabin showed signs of having been lived in. The report stated, the skeletal remains show no signs of violence. The individual appears to have died of natural causes. The arrangement of the pennies suggests deliberate placement, raising the possibility that the deceased survived for some time, possibly with assistance. The implication was staggering. Small Thomas hadn't drowned. He'd escaped, reached this cabin, and survived for an unknown period before dying. And someone had known, had helped him, had buried him with those 8 pennies. The answer came from an elderly woman named Patience Freeman, 76, a former slave. She walked into the Atlanta Constitution and told her story. On the morning after the murder, she had seen small Thomas emerge from Redemption Creek. She had hidden him, then led him to the cabin, bringing him supplies over the following weeks. On her 3rd visit, she found him dead, the pennies already arranged. I think he'd done it himself, she said. Laid them pennies out before he passed. I buried him best I could. Never told nobody until now. When asked why she'd risked everything, she said, because somebody had to. That boy had been treated like he wasn't human. He'd done a terrible thing, but he was still a child. Still deserved a chance. So I gave him one. He didn't survive it, but at least he died free. The story faded again after 1889. The remains were buried in a pauper's cemetery. The cabin collapsed. The site was paved over. But the case left a mark. The 8-cent price became a symbol of the dehumanization inherent in the slave system. Scholars debated whether small Thomas's actions were murder or self-defense. Oral histories collected in the 1930s contained versions of the story. One former slave, interviewed at 94, said, "We told that story to our children to teach them 2 things. First, that the system would break you if it could. And second, that even when you're small, even when you're damaged, even when they tell you you're only worth 8 cents, you still got power if you know how to use it." That boy, he used what he had. He died on his terms. Sometimes that's all you get. The copper pennies were distributed among the railroad workers and eventually lost. 8 cents scattered to the winds. In the end, the story of small Thomas asks questions that 1851 Georgia couldn't answer, questions we still struggle with today. What is justice in a system built on injustice? What is murder when life itself has been stolen? What is freedom worth to someone told they're worth less than pocket change? The historical record provides no satisfying answers. It offers only facts: a purchase for 8 cents, a death beneath a cotton press, footprints leading into a creek, a cabin in the woods, and 8 pennies arranged in a circle. The rest remains hidden in the same darkness that once filled the Hateville cotton processing facility. This story shows how easily human beings can be reduced to monetary value, and how that reduction creates the conditions for violence that society then condemns while ignoring its own complicity. The 8-cent boy's name appears in one document. His crime in none. His grave is paved over. But his story remains, a reminder that every human life has worth beyond what any market assigns. What do you think? Do you believe Small Thomas acted alone? Could Patience Freeman's account be trusted? Leave your thoughts below. If you found this tale haunting, subscribe, hit that bell, and share it. These are the stories they didn't teach in school, the truths buried beneath official records. We'll keep bringing them to you, one forgotten tale at a time. See you in the next video.